We were talking yesterday about this question of Rabbi Moshe Kunitz's position on tefillah, on what he's saying to the reformers about getting rid of the silent prayer. Now, they had only asked him three questions. It's clear that they did not ask him. He reiterates what they asked him. They asked him, can you use a Sephardic pronunciation? It's a. Can you get rid of the silent Amidah? And can you use an organ? They did not ask him about prayer in German. So number one, that's interesting. I think the point that was made by Moshe Sammet in an article that they picked and chose who to ask what questions to seems true. So he had no problem with Mivta Sephardi, with Sephardic pronunciation. He didn't seem to have much problem with an organ, actually. But his language is also interesting. And on the question of getting rid of the silent Amidah, it depends how you read this paragraph. I think it's pretty clear that he does not want them to get rid of it, but perhaps it seems like Moshe Sammet, and I found that article, reads it that he does, but I think that's wrong. So the question kind of comes up: who is Rabbi Moshe Kunitz? I mean, he's interesting. Let me read you a paragraph here. You get an interesting sense of right. If you remember, in his discussion of this getting rid of the silent Amidah, one of the things he says is, other people pray with a silent prayer, and other people have confession, and that's part of our silent Amidah, right? So he's in Hungary. And he's obviously not taking the position, that people like the Chassam Sofer are going to take. He's very different than that. And Hungary, it's interesting. I was reading that Hungary was not, we sometimes, our lens of Jewish Hungarian life in the 1820s is sometimes through the eyes of the Chassam Sofer. Now, and Pressburg. Now, we sometimes think that like Hungary is much less modern, but it's actually not true. Hungary actually was pretty modern, and maybe that's why the Chassam Sofer is sort of reacting the way he is. But the majority of Jews remember that the neologues, this kind of middle ground, really emerged in Hungary. So you had in Germany the radical reform, but that I don't know how big that was. And of course you have the Enlightenment everywhere, but Hungary actually at the time it does have a very sort of open-minded and modern sensibility, and so when he argues about the organ also, he says, you're doing it to attract people. That's a good thing. It's going to bring the people that don't really know the language that we're praying in. And then he had argued, and we had looked at this, that, we have non-Jews, light or put out candles in the shul, so why not have them play an organ? And he says, we're not just doing it for anything, we're doing it for something holy here. And then he says he thinks you can do it. You can have a non-Jew play the organ on Shabbos and shul. And then he says toward the end here, let's see, sort of compares it to other nations. Maybe it's this last paragraph I was thinking. And then he even though they didn't say to him, how often should we daven? He obviously knows that they're not davening on the weekdays. He says, he said, I recommend to you that you open the shul every day and every evening, and that you should have 10 people who can make the minyan. And he says, look around at the other, houses of worship. And Do you find that there's a church that's only open once a week? The other nations open up their houses of worship every day. And people go to pray. And we are calling on, the God who is living. We should do that too. He says, so guard the chok, guard the laws, guard the halacha, and do what is good in the eyes of God, to be straight. And God's goodness will be upon you, and you will make a great name for yourselves, among the Jewish people. So it's very interesting, his approach, right? Now that he uses a couple of different methods. This idea of his that, being a Jew in a halachic way or in a religious way is not going to separate us from the other nations. Like, he understands what their issue is, right? Now, he's very different than an Italian rabbi, maybe, or, who's just like kind of answering the questions naively. He's not so naive. Like, I think Rabbi Kunitz really is giving interesting answers because he's clearly very traditional, and he clearly is pushing them. To me, I think he's saying, don't get rid of the Silent Amidah, and he's saying have a minyan twice a day, and he sees, I think, the potential in reform to engage the people, and he's not, he's definitely not like the more right-wing Hungarian rabbis that are just kind of putting their foot down. So you get a little bit of a sense of who he is here, that he's definitely a traditionalist. But he's also willing to, he's sort of, it's totally anachronistic, but, there's sort of a modern orthodoxy about him. And I think the question of how you read the paragraph about getting rid of the silent Amidah depends on how you view him. Because it's a little, again, it is unclear. But I think if you, so let me read this note from Mark Shapiro, in which he clearly struggled also with who Rabbi Moshe Kunitz is. He says, Ramash Kasav Rav Yosef Schwartz, Zichron Moshe, Grossvarden, Tafresh Tzadiches. So there's a book, Yodea Sher Moshe Kunitz. This person knew that Rav Moshe Kunitz had written something in Noga HaTzedek, in this book by the Reformers. They reform me. That's how they say it, by the way. When people are, when they don't say Yotze La'or, it came out to light. That's what you usually say when a book is published. They say Yotze La'chosha, came out to dark, through Eliezer Lieberman, who is more of a reformer. So people think that Rav Moshe Kunitz, because he's in the book, is a reformer. Right? The Rabbi Mordechai Ellisberg called him Chacham Maskil Echad, right? So it's always an interesting question. What do you do with people like this? Came up with Shaul Lieberman a lot, Rabbi Lieberman. What they had to quote him because he wrote so many Sfarim, he wrote Tosefta Pshuta, but how do you quote him, right? So they would call him Chacham Echad, that kind of thing. Rosh Shvil HaZahav, there's a book called Shvil HaZahav published in Varsha in 100 years ago, and it says Ulam Zeh Nachum Klal Hukamo Gedola Italia Rav Shem Tov Simon Rav Yachai Kanadi Shuvasem Gankim Tzedek. He says, no, maybe Rabbi Kunitz is like the Italian rabbis who lo hikiru at the Reformi Germania. They didn't really get what German reform was. And they didn't realize that the Reform were using them, right? The Reform were picking and choosing who to ask and what to ask. Apparently, some of these rabbis did turn to others to find out what's the nature of this German reform. Something happened. I guess he had written a book. Rabbi Moshe Kunitz had written a book on the generations of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So in the Mishnayos, in the regular, I think Yochanan Baz Mishnayos, there is an essay about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi by Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, and that was published standard in the Mishnah until for 200 years, for 100 years.
This would like be in the first volume, like the introduction.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so. It's in there somewhere. I didn't look it up, but I've seen this more than once. And when you read it, there's nothing. It's normal. There's nothing. There's nothing reformist in it. But somebody published a new copy of the Mishnah. He didn't know who is this Ramosh Kunitz. And when he heard that some people suspect Ramosh Kunitz of having been a reformer, he didn't check it out, and he just got rid of the essay. There was some more recent defus of the classic Mishnayos, and they left it out. And it's because of this question of who he was. Censor mutav lahem lahashmit mitchilas mishnayos samayim shenitfas miyad kamar mishkan maimer al diktul Mishnah. Interesting. Shlomo Levinson. That's very interesting. So Mark Shapiro, who knows these things, right? He says if you want to act like the censor, you shouldn't have taken out Moshe Kunitz from the Mishnah. You should have taken out the essay right after that, which is on Diktuk Lashon HaMishnah, because he's more of a reformer. Shlomo Levinson. Rasham, we'll have to look in the classic Mishnayos to see this. Rasham ba'ara harishona odo sefer kohelet v'tavin lama ani mitchavein. He says, look at what that essay says about Kohelet, but apparently they didn't take him out. We'll have to look that up. I'm sure the shul has an old copy. And we know that Ramosh Kunitz was known as somebody who feared God. As Rabbi Baruch, the Av Bezdin of Hamburg, says in his letter to the Chassam Sofer, he calls Ramosh Kunitz, I guess, Yirei Elokim. For Shmuel, a Cohen Weingarten, Chassam Sofer v'Talmida. Apparently, there's a book by Shmuel Weingarten on the Chassam Sofer and his students, and Rav Chaim Falaji, Ivana Vagon Rav Yitzchak, Vagon Rav Avram, Mitzatim Ramosh Kunitz Harbe. Apparently, he is quoted by many people, Sfardim here, that he is one of the Gedolei Ador. Chenu b'sefer od Gedolei Sfarad. Ramash Kazma Hagon Haneman b'sifro Arim Nisi Amsel Zivamos B'nei Brak. So people quote him, and they quote him as somebody who is kosher. Rasham that Alech Sham. He did write a book also at Mashkun. It's called Bar Yochai. Because of Agon Rav Moshe Shpilman, somebody wrote to, I guess, Mark Shapiro about this and said, since there's nothing in his books, even Bar Yochai, I think in Bar Yochai actually argues that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai did write the Zohar, that is heretical. So you shouldn't start forbidding now after 100 years, 200 years. You shouldn't put his books in Cherem. Because Gedolei Yisrael quote him. And they learned his Sfarim. But Tzaddik, and to look back now historically and say, just because he was in this book by the reformers that he's a reformer doesn't make sense. So what do you have to say? That Ramosh Kunitz didn't really know who he was dealing with. He didn't really understand the reform. Even though he wasn't that far. I guess he was in Hungary, although it was very early. Mustavar Kedavarav, the Hari Ramosh Kunitz Zalhay, Talmid of Shalagon, Balna to be Yehuda, Zahaya Betchil Zman, Shitchila reform of Farsim, the Atem, Blahim, Forcemen, Sharish, Pararosh, Lana, Minus. This is very early on in the reform movement, and people don't really understand it. Reform. So you can't say that he's supporting reform. He's answering the question. Now, this is partly true. Maybe but on the other hand, he's not totally naive. He does say to them, you're not going to be different than the Christians if you do the Amidah aloud, right? And he understands what they want. He understands that they're trying to be more assimilationist. Now, on the other hand, though, maybe he doesn't realize, he thinks they're sort of, again, to be anachronistic, modern Orthodox. The Dvar of Nechonim, V'divrei Abal ben Yochai, Mitzotim l'Rav B'Sifrei Moshe Shpilman. Ela shelo haya lo lahavi raya mizeh asher Moshe Kunitz haya mitalmidav Hanod b'Yehuda ki elo gamar and Choron haya mitalmidav. Now, the truth is that others that were more reformed than Moshe Kunitz were also students of the Nod Yehuda. Okay, so he says Leda ledeot chashuvot al toda shal Moshe Kunitz. He says you can also look in Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Greenwald's book Makoret Lakoret Yisrael. There are these books that go through all the rabbis and authors. This came out 100 years ago. And he writes there that Prague mazkirim et shmo ben Gedol Yisrael v'meizkos neshamas. That apparently in Prague, when they would make a kelmale for the Gedol Yisrael, and they did include Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, and that was written in Tafresh Tzadi Daled, 1934. But Kayetz Tashsat, so he says in the summer of Tafshin Samach Das, that's 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the Congress, this must be a Jewish studies gathering, this was a Jewish studies conference in Jerusalem. So Mark Shapiro says, Hartzta, Professor Sharon Flato. He says, Professor Sharon Plato was lecturing, and he's the wife of my friend, Sharon Flato. That's what it is. She's the wife of my friend Rabbi Yissaschar. Oh, that's interesting. This must have been the first wife of Yissaschar Katz. That's very interesting. They got divorced eventually. Oh no, maybe this is his new wife. I don't know. Anyway, Yissaschar Katz's wife, I guess, is a professor of Jewish studies. Mark Shapiro had an argument with her. Al Rav Moshe Kunitz. V'acharei kol hartzat hayo bein hashomim shvatzel lahatel dofi b'shuso shel Rav Moshe Kunitz. And there were those in the audience that wanted to say Moshe Kunitz was a reformer. V'dachiti et divrayim, and I pushed aside their words. V'hiskim et yididei Maoz Kahana. There was a professor there named Maoz Kahana who agreed with me that indeed Rav Moshe Kunitz should not be considered a reformer. So that's very interesting. So, right, in other words, the jury's been out on Rav Moshe Kunitz for 200 years, which is very right. And 15 years ago, Mark Shapiro was having an argument at a Jewish Studies conference, and people are divided. And you can see why. In other words, he's clearly extremely traditional and a very big Talmid Chacham, but he also is not totally naive. He understands where the reformers are coming from, at least to some extent. But on the other hand, I think it's true that the reformers, they didn't give him all the information. They don't seem to have asked him about their intentions to have davening only in German. Okay, so we will, this will be the last class for a little while because I'm going to be away for a week and then it's Pesach. So the Monday after Pesach, the 28th, we can, what was it, 28th? I can't remember, I emailed it, 24th maybe, we can regather. Okay, have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.